welcome to Heliotropes. My name is Julia.
And my name's Kwadjo.
We're back.
Yeah. Hey. Shout out to our number one fans, Rose, Holyoke Rose, and NYC Mers. Yeah.
So we're gonna do, thanks to them for giving us some inspiration and motivation to get restarted, hopefully on a more regular basis. Today we're gonna do kind of a catch up on some things that we've been noticing or seeing and think are important to mention. So where do you want to start?
Well, always, remember here at the beginning that you can fast forward or you can speed up this video so you can get through it faster if you want. Just go to the settings on YouTube and click, ×2 or whatever, however fast you want it to go. But I mean, there's a lot of foreign policy stuff that's gone on since our last broadcast. And so I'd like to hit at least very briefly on all of those things, or as many of them as we can. There's obviously, been the movement that's gone on in Palestine regarding Israel. There's the Cuba blockade and the protests, the ongoing blockade and the protests. There's the assassination of the Haitian president, Moise. And now more recently, the earthquake, that's kind of definitely happened. And then Afghanistan is back in the news as, the Taliban resurgence. That's what's being cited and obviously leveraged to continue occupation. So we can talk about all those things on my end. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, a couple of those things that you mentioned, we did cover, I think, in our last one quite a bit about Israel and Palestine. I think that's where our last one was on, maybe. And then talking a little bit about the climate. I don't particularly like calling it the climate crisis because it's just ongoing and it's going to continue to get worse unless dramatic changes occur, which seems really unlikely, but that's been, impacting countries globally and seems to be, I don't know if it's just like covered more, if things are getting more intense. I feel like we should mention something about Cuomo resigning and some of the language he used and some of the language Joe Biden used around that. That's kind of where I am right now, I think. And I guess COVID, maybe.
Oh, yeah. There's some stuff there. All right, well, if we can revisit the Palestine thing for a second. Mm-hmm. I had some notes. I was going to make a video, put it on Instagram, and get you. I might still do that, but I took some notes, just some thoughts from after we did that I wanted to share. One, when you're going and looking at the history, I thought this was really interesting because if you look at the Wikipedia page, there's a Wikipedia page specifically for like Palestine-Israeli conflict or something like that. I think that's what the timeline of the conflict. So you can Google that and find the Wikipedia page. And if you look at the sources, as well as the wording, it's all very interesting. Up until from like the early 1900s to like maybe the 1970s, 1980s, there's a lot of the predominant death count that's recorded is the Israeli death count, right? Thought that was really interesting. They make sure to let you know in every conflict, like that this many Israeli people died. The Palestinian deaths are recorded as, I forget what the term they used was, but it's a dehumanizing term. It's an antagonizing term. So it's recorded as infiltrators, right? Mm-hmm. This many infiltrators died, suggesting that like Palestinian people leaving Palestinian territory and going into Israeli occupied territory, all of them are infiltrators. It's like if we were to refer to every immigrant to this country as an infiltrator, So, I mean, there's just interesting stuff there, and I'm sure that reflects in like a lot of sources before like the 1990s. And, it's just
was gonna say even now too.
Yeah.
That's how the New York Times basically writes about what's going on.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your sources, looking at the slants, looking at the biases, and keeping in mind that both sides, like when you zone into like the personal, the micro level, absolute micro level, it makes sense that there would be, really strong feelings on both sides, because both sides have committed, like we said in that video, like violence against one another. But don't get caught up there, because at the end of the day, what matters is like, the institutional violence, or all the violence matters. But like, if you want to end the conflict, you've got to pay attention to the demands and pay attention to like who's doing what on what level. Violence never starts with, well, shit, no, never mind. I was gonna say someone throwing a punch, but as far as like state violence and things like that, you look at the state, Israel's fucking up. They're not doing the thing, right? So, I've got other notes. I don't remember what they are, but go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that was something that we did together, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like I had a couple things too, and now I don't quite remember what they were either. Yeah. But keep paying attention. I mean, that was one of the main things that we included in our last podcast too. I mean, the violence is still going on, right? And since then, there have been rulings that have made legal continued occupation of Palestinian land and homes and neighborhoods, and destroying, that's not the word I'm looking for, but that's what's happening, destroying Palestinian homes and communities for Jewish Israelis and Jewish folks to move into, and I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but that's still going on. I mean, as soon as the prime ministers changed over, there was more violence and more bombings, more state violence against the Palestinians. So keep paying attention. There's still folks to follow on social media, and still things, that you can do here in terms of elevating those voices that are on the ground in Palestine.
Right. As we move into the other foreign policy stuff and kind of bridging from, the Palestine-Israeli question, I think it's also important to keep in mind, there's this big overarching, one of the central questions of that whole conflict is the role that international organizations and internationalism in general plays. So we're thinking about, right, I mean, we can think of the conflict in terms of what Palestine thinks, what Israel thinks, and what the U.S. thinks. But that's really very wrong. I guess this is a matter of opinion. My ask is that you consider your own personal position on what international organizations have, what role they should play. What role the UN, what role UN legislation should play, resolution passing legislation, what role the International Criminal Court should play, like international, criminal justice, all these things. Because when we're, again, looking at when we're looking at U.S. imperialism, one of the big things we have, and then, we have to keep in mind is that U.S. imperialism, as well as the ongoing imperialism of other Western, powers like France and England and Portugal and Morocco, all of that is really flying in the face of some pretty fundamental UN resolutions, right? So you have to look at the role that those powers are playing, these organizations are playing, look at what they're doing, what their charter is, look at the UN charter, and decide for yourself whether or not you think that's a good thing, and then be consistent with it. Is it a good thing that the UN is formed to stop states from initiating in crimes of aggression against other states? If you agree with that, then that has to follow through with everything, right? You have to then be okay, well, that means no state has the right to go out and initiate even preemptive aggression against another state, because that's how that stuff happens. It's like, oh, okay, well, like no one can do it except the U.S. We can use preemptive measures against other countries. And then that preemption becomes a rule. It's supposed to be an exception, but it becomes a rule for the United States, and then it becomes a justification for every instance of intervention. Maybe not every instance, but in instances where they have difficulty finding some other cause, like, oh, yes, like their people are just bad and threatening the government, so we have to go in, right? That's not a preemptive thing. That's aid, right? Humanitarian intervention, right? And then just also looking up the definitions of these words, right? Because you'll find that, right? What does it mean for the U.S. to engage in humanitarian intervention? Typically, it means military intervention that has some sort of capitalist, aspect to it, as far as going in and making that place better for U.S. investors, Western investors. And you would think it has something to do with making the lives of the people better, but it seldom ever does. And I just bring this up because it relates directly to Haiti, Cuba, like all of our activities in Latin America. Yeah, Venezuela, as well as what's going on in various parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world.
And, analyze what informs your decision of, like, when you're looking at the UN, and if you agree with, like what their charter is or some of these other organizations, like also then ask yourself what informs your opinion on that and how you feel about that. And is it propaganda, right? If it's what you learned from your middle school history textbook in the United States, then it's probably propaganda. So, like, maybe consider, like, what are the other alternatives here? And, why is this what I learned versus, like, some of these other perspectives? I think that's important because, yeah, like, you could get on board with the UN and then follow that through to the end. But, like, why are you getting on board with the UN in the first place? Yeah.
Not that anyone has to be on board with the UN.
No, you don't.
Yeah. But, and then, like, also keeping in mind that being on board with the UN doesn't mean agreeing with everything they're doing now, right? Because the way the UN operates now is as, it's governed by a bully, right? And that bully is the US. The way the UN operates now is rules for all of the other member nations, and then a set of rules for the U.S. And like I said, that set of rules comes out of, the U.S. being the global power, like almost singular global power at the time of its inception, right? And having, like, the military might, the ability to rule by force all of the other nations in the UN. And I guess we could do a whole future podcast on, like, the UN and its structure and the Security Council and votes and resolutions and how all of that is really, stacked. How the UN is currently organized explicitly to, serve the world and the countries of the world. Some, ecumenical platitudes. But it's implicitly organized to serve the interests of the United States and further the interests of the United States, again, by holding everyone else accountable to one set of rules and then holding the United States accountable to a different set of rules. It's implicit versus explicit. So just keep in mind, like, the way the UN is now is not the way the UN should be. It's not the way the UN always will be, right? Presumably. There's room for change.
Yeah, that has me thinking about something that could get us really off topic, but I'm still going to mention it, but that doesn't mean that we have to, go down into it. But it's something I've been thinking about, I think, a lot over the past, few weeks. A good friend of mine used to say that, when we were studying psychology and thinking about the people the founders of psychology, that critiquing, yes, was important, and also recognizing that they were doing the best they could with the information they had. Right. And it was something that I honestly could really never get behind, because the question was then doing the best for who and with what they had from what. And so, like, that's something that I think about, right? Like, with the UN or really any kind of historical power or entity is, you don't need to like sympathize, or you don't need to provide excuses for the people who created whatever they created. Decades later, they're fine. I mean, they might be dead, but even in their life, they were fine, right? Like, the powers that be who created the UN and fucked over a lot of people were ultimately fine. And so, like, we don't need to, I think, yes, it's important to understand, like, where they were coming from, to understand, like, how we feel and think about certain things. But looking back with a lot of sympathy, or having, like, giving them the benefit of the doubt that they were doing the best they could with what they have, I don't think is an appropriate way to consider history in this context. And really any history involving white people and the United States.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, that whole thing reminds me of the critical race theory debacle, which is also blown up.
Talk about that.
Yeah, since our last broadcast, which, and I guess, just as far as, what Julia said, as far as being sure to analyze, like, why you're taking certain positions, and this idea of doing the best you can with what you have, like, shit, we have the internet, like, we have access to so many resources. And my rule of, the heuristic that I'm going to throw out here is that when you're thinking about, like, the best you can with what you have, when we get to that what you have part, go to the source. Just go to the source. If you want to know what the UN's about, go to the UN and read the charter, right? Like, if you want to know what a given resolution is about, go read, like, find that resolution. I'm not saying you have to, like, look up, like, do the UN index, and you should, if you have the time to do it. But, like, go to a source that's going to quote it and cite it, right? Like, and, like, with the critical race theory thing, like, part of the reason, and again, we're not going to get into that now, but part of the reason it's blowing up is because it's being used, critical race theory, the phrase, is being used as a political football, right? Like, it's a red herring. It's not actually a debate about critical race theory, because all the people who are condemning it don't actually know what critical race theory is. They're just going to other people who are writing about critical race theory, or, like, talking about critical race theory, the phrase, to find out what it, like, there was this guy on Instagram on one of the accounts, and he was like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Like, I read a 19-page paper by, like, this guy who was talking about critical race theory, about critical race theory. So I think, like, I have a pretty good idea of what it is. And I was like, you can't just, like, read an article by, like, an essay that was in critical race theory. Like, why would you go through all this effort? And that's the core thing, is that people put in a lot of effort to remain ignorant as to whatever they're talking about, while maintaining the veneer of knowledgeability. Like, oh, I read this paper, which is tangentially related to the topic we're talking about, so by default, I am entitled to have an opinion on it, which is fine. I mean, that's true. You're entitled to have an opinion on whatever you want, but, like, it's not an educated opinion, and it's not a valid opinion if you still don't know. Anyway, so go to the source.
And I would say, I don't know if people put in a lot of effort to remain ignorant so much as people put in a lot of effort to maintain their scope of the world and, like, their knowledge and understanding of the world, as opposed to, like, being like, okay, let me go to the source of this, or let me look up this, or let me look up this differing opinion, and be able to take in that information and then go from there and decide, like, okay, has my opinion on this changed? Has my understanding of this changed? Or, well, not has it, but how has it, right? Because if you read something and it further affirms what you're already thinking about, right, then that has changed, because now you have a deeper understanding of all of the different kind of perspectives of something.
Right. I would say that's the same thing. I mean, in this
that's true, I guess. Like, remaining ignorant if you're just,
staying
that's
in
true.
bubble.
Staying in your, I was going to say staying in your lane, but in reality, people, I don't think that's an appropriate, piece.
So,
we'll come back to critical race theory.
Yeah, we will. Future cast. Cuba, I mean, I guess if we're going in chronological order, let's do Cuba.
Okay.
So, For those of you who don't know, Cuba recently was in the news, and this is recently like a month ago. Or I mean, really, it's been like for a good part of, well, yeah, recently a month ago. I remember in February there was a caravan here in Atlanta for like in support of like Cuban ending the embargo. So, for those of you who don't know, Cuba has long been the apple of the United States' imperialist eye. You know, like literally, founding fathers are on record as having been like, what, Thomas Jefferson? Like, yo, Cuba is like the shit. We need to get Cuba. He didn't. That's not a quote, but like it's pretty much what he said. You know,
Would be the coolest thing he'd ever said in his life.
yeah,
The first part
like
of that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the idea, John Quincy Adams is also, you know, on record as having, and they were pretty much like, you know, like Cuba, we want it, but the Spanish has it, and we don't need to worry because by the laws of political gravitation, that's the quote, Cuba will eventually fall under our control. Fast forward to like 1898, Cuba's fighting its war, right? This is the Spanish-American War, which is terribly named. Cuba's fighting a war against the Spanish for independence. They're about to get it. You know, keep in mind, 1898, this is on the heels of, oh, actually it's not. I was going to say the French Revolution, but it's actually 100 years after the French Revolution. I don't remember what was going on in 1898.
In the history of time, it was on the heels of the French Revolution.
Yes, exactly, yeah. As we are now. But they were fighting against the Spanish. They were about to win, and then the U.S. goes in and is like, yo, we're... Right, so this is Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders and the ride on San Juan Hill. Like, U.S. intervention, a lot of reliable sources say it was not necessary. Like, Cuba would have successfully gained independence had it not been for U.S. intervention. And those sources typically cite, you know, pragmatic reasons for U.S. intervention versus like altruistic reasons, right? And that's, again, something to pay attention to is why are we getting involved in these things, right? These conflicts. All the things that we could be doing in the world, right? All of the things that we're not doing in the world. And then look at the consequences of the things that we do, right? Like when we get involved in Libya and leave it, and now it's like destroyed and like quality of life is much worse than before, and there's like active African slave trade continuing off the shores of Libya. Like, did we get involved for altruistic reasons? You can make a strong argument that no, since we've allowed slavery to flourish in the absence or in the wake of our involvement, no, we didn't get involved for altruistic reasons. That's the argument, but you know, you always have to listen to people's arguments and, you know, decide for yourself based on everything we said before.
Kwadjo's a better person than me.
I don't think that's true. So, you know, 1898, Spanish-American War is what we call it. Remember the Maine, so that's another thing I remember that from textbooks, is like the Maine was a ship that was docked off of, in Cuba, like off the coast, in Havana or somewhere. And it exploded in the bay, like where it was docked, and it sank. And then like I don't remember that any like U.S. military personnel perished in that event, but the big thing it made you, and this is in the time of yellow journalism, which is just a hyper sensationalized news. So like people came back and they were like, "Yo, remember the Maine, like yo." The Spanish blew up the Maine in Cuba, so we have to go get involved. It was one of those things, yes. Like a possibly, what do they call it? White flag, false flag attack. So this happened, and then Cuba, the United States and Cuba entered an agreement, right? The United States played a role in, obviously, Cuba won with the help of the United States, and they entered into a mutual constitutional agreement, which essentially said that Cuba is independent under the condition that like the United States has the purview, the ability to step in and intervene however it sees fit at any given time, right? So and this, again, this was a time when this was happening. I think that was like 1904 or 1906, when the United States was engaging in this kind of like imperialist, these activities all over the place. Puerto Rico, in Guam, the American Samoas, the Philippines, that was the big one, you know, because again, going in and getting where the Spanish were once a major world power, and this is just kind of a continuation of like the U.S. Capitalizing on those former possessions of the Spanish. Fast forward to like 1960, we can fast forward to 1960 or 50. Cuba was pretty much like a capitalist, and really the rest of Latin and South America was a capitalist. It was a haven. It was a destination, right? Because again, capitalism, markets, and we could do a podcast about that too. But like, there's capitalists want places to sell things, right? And I saw it described somewhere as Cuba was a captive market for American capitalists, which I think is a good term to describe literally the situation in Latin and South America during that time period and to this day. And what that essentially means, and we'll come back to this with Haiti as well, because they did the exact same thing, is American investors, again, go in and say, hey, you know, like, it doesn't work for us to have people be paid well, right? Because if we have to pay higher wages, our profits are going to go down. So we want people to be paid lower wages. We want workers to have less rights. We want workers to stop growing like whatever indigenous products or using indigenous products, native products, whatever products they're already using. We want them to use our products to grow with our seeds, to grow with all these things. And we also want them to buy these things from us, because we're not going to give you all these things that you don't need, but we want you to have for free so we can make money, right? So all of these things and more, I mean, they just end in the reign of Batista, who was the last president before the Cuban Revolution. And he was just, you know, like rampant, villainous dictator, you know, and of course I'm oversimplifying. He was a human being, more complex, more nuanced and all that. But the Cuban Revolution happened because he was, by all accounts, a terrible dictator. He was, you know, he was not good for the people. And, you know, there was no hiding it. And the U.S. was funding his reign, right? Providing military support, providing, obviously, you know, the ideological grounding that he's a friend, ally of democracy and shit like that. So Cuban Revolution happens, and by 1960, Cuba's under the control of Fidel Castro. Full disclosure, the United States did provide some sort of funding for Castro as well during his revolution, but they did it as they were providing funding to Batista, right? It was just a kind of hedge your bets kind of thing. Like, okay, well, shit, like, we don't know who's going to win this. Like, this Batista guy was not popular at all. So, like, maybe this Castro guy can win. And if he wins, then we'll just talk to him and have him be like, yo, we helped you win, right? Like, you're going to help us control this state. And Castro was like, fuck nah, yeah, I ain't doing that shit. Like, anyway. So the U.S. imposes an embargo. And I think it was initially like an embargo on food, on like everything except for like food and some medical supplies. And then over time, it expanded to like everything, and over time it's expanded and contracted to varying degrees. But the point is, even to this day, it's the longest going economic embargo against I think any nation. Go ahead.
And destroyed like Cuban farmland and animals, so like the inability for Cuba basically to like feed its people, right, and then like imposed all of these additional restrictions. So like pretty much decimated Cuba. Well, in some ways, not decimated as in like they're not functioning, but did some pretty fucked up shit. Yeah. And then did this. Yeah.
And then continued to do fucked up shit.
Well, yeah.
I mean, because like this was really, because like the Cuban Revolutionary struggle was from like 58 to 60. You know, so like they imposed this embargo. And then they did all this stuff that Julia just described. Like, several assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. Like, he's famous for that. The CIA is famous for that. Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed. But, like, there was plenty of, like, you know, biological warfare, chemical warfare, anthrax was involved at some point. And, also keeping in mind that Cuba had aligned itself. Actually, I think they were non-aligned, but they were working with the Soviets, right? In this classic move of, well, shit, if the United States is not going to help us and you're also going to block us from receiving, like, the things we need to survive as an island nation. Because think about that, like, an embargo against an island nation, that's devastating.
The island nation that's closest to you.
Right.
Right,
Like, we could easily have not done this embargo.
Yeah.
And easily sent them stuff. But all this was happening, and then another really important part of the story is that, like, the people who are against the Cuban Revolution left, right? Like, Cuban Revolution happens, it was bloody, it was not, like, an enlightened revolution as far as, nonviolence. So people who felt like they were in the crosshairs did not want to be there anymore, so they went to the closest nation, which is this one. So suddenly you have, like, this growing Cuban population of, like, Cuban capitalists, I'll say, for lack of a better word, American sympathizers, capitalism sympathizers, opponents to the revolution, and this population is growing here in the States, and suddenly, like, the United States has their own captive audience again of, like, anti-Cuban Cubans, like anti-Cuban revolutionary Cubans, right, which has just been leveraged over the years, like, to be like, oh, look at all these Cubans here in America who are protesting, right? So that's what happened recently, is there were protests that kind of, like, boiled over. The goal of the embargo, as it must be stated, and as it was recognized back then, was essentially, over time, to undermine the people's faith in the Cuban government. So what we saw here just now, like a month ago, was that happening, right? Due to the pandemic and, like, the closure of borders, reclosure, the lack of resources that are going in because people just aren't producing, all over the world, people aren't producing as much. And then the ongoing embargo, Cuba has very little recourse for, like, anything. So conditions are dire and people start protesting. Now there's a question of, like, who was doing the protesting. Like, there's people, images, video of people protesting saying down with the revolution, stuff like that, and waving American flags. Like, that's pretty much, a sign that, like, America's in there. It's one thing to not like your government. It's another thing to, ask the government with the worst record on, like, intervening in other people's governments to step in and intervene in your own government. Especially when you look at that history of, like, what Cuba looked like before the revolution and who played the major part in crafting that. Cuba was a dictatorship, brutal, with very few redeeming qualities outside of, like, the capitalist class, and that was crafted by the United States, right? So, like, yes, like, I don't particularly condone all the actions, especially the violence, the brutal suppression of, like, the Cuban dictatorship, under Castro. And also, right, like, when you look at those conditions, what more can you expect? Like, if we want their government to change, we have to change how our government interacts with them, right? Lift the embargo. Stop sending, infiltrators, like actual CIA infiltrators, into their government to overturn things, right? Like, stop trying to create this captive audience again. Just, like, let them be, right? Laissez-faire.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to consider some of the things that did come out of the dictatorship in terms of, like, some of the benefits, right? Like, we don't talk about, I mean...
The Castro dictatorship, the revolution.
Yeah, in terms of, like, education and medical care, and Cuba is still now, right, like, often talked about and has an excellent medical care system, right, and is creating vaccines, has, like, 5 in trials or something the last I read, right, but those are things that, like, we don't learn about or we don't talk about, or then, they're, like, some of the first people on the ground in Haiti following the earthquake to provide aid, and some of the people who are, like, who have what seems like quite a consistent record of helping in other places around the globe fight for the people and what the people want. It's, I don't know, in that way, like it does feel like there are some parallels to the Palestinian people, and to other kind of like communities across the globe that are, I guess, like consistently oppressed in some ways and fighting, like for the people and for the betterment of the people. And so, like being in the U.S., we don't hear about some of the excellent parts of Cuba. We just hear, right, like Cuban cigars, like Havana, dancing, and like that you can't go to Cuba.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you can go to Cuba, but like now you can't go to Cuba, or like decades ago, it was a Hollywood like resort basically, right? Like all these Hollywood, like these famous Hollywood people, famous Americans would go there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the association with communism.
Right.
Because that's like the other like really big thing. I remember being like learning that there's like only 3 communist countries left in the world: China, Russia, and Cuba. And, the implication's like, oh my gosh, Cuba's right next door. Like, what if they do something? What
if they invade the U.S.?
Yeah, which is absurd. Like, absurd to think about. But that's actually how, like, policy is crafted in, like, foreign policy is crafted in the United States is by stoking all these fears, right? That, like, these countries that are, like, woefully under-resourced because of our intervention for so long will crawl out of like some cave, no knocking at the country, but like that's pretty much that would be equivalent of the reality of the situation, is that like they would come out of some hole with like some sticks and stones and just like the boldest inclination, urge, desire, and intention to invade the United States.
To take out the U.S. military.
Right.
Where all of your tax dollars go. Mine too.
Which is why you need to spend, like so many tax dollars protecting, defending from that inevitability, if we don't. It's ridiculous. So also keep that in mind.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess, just kind of, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but maybe one of my last ones for today too, right, is like all of the medical advances, right? If we start to think about COVID and other, medical issues right now, like all the medical advances that are happening in Cuba that we could also, like that the entire world could benefit from, right? Like the embargo fucks all of that over. And at a time where like the world needs to be leveraging all possible
resources, options.
Yeah, like to really, for climate, for medical care, right? Like for generally improving the lives of people. There's this like tiny little powerful country, right? That could be an incredible resource that in the United States, we will never understand the full extent of that as a country because, like you said, like there's no like governmental conversation or understanding or like just kind of like, let's try and move on from this, right? It's just this like, no, we've hated you for however long because you won't like let us come in and do all of these things. And so now like we're just going to hold that over you for the rest of our lives because it's really fun to like have this game.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, 2 things. One, the Obama administration, as far as the short list of things that one can commend them on, warming relations with Cuba is one of them, right? Like
that's how I went to Cuba.
Yeah. And then Trump came in and he just kind of like slashed that and he was like, nah, we ain't fucking with Cuba. And then the second thing, to your point about like why we're continuing to do this, it's not just, and this is like, this goes back to the planners, like the people who made the decision to invade. It's not just about like Cuba resisting attempts at capitalizing Cuba. It goes back to, Noam Chomsky calls it the mafia doctrine, in the sense that like Cuba has successfully demonstrated, and I was listening actually yesterday to an interview with Fidel Castro from like 1985. And the interviewer was like, there's 3 reasons that the U.S. says that you're you're a bad guy. And one of them was your successful defiance of like U.S. influence or something like that. So the idea, right, behind the mafia doctrine is that if someone who, right, you terrorize all these people and get them to pay you protection money, right, protection money from you, and possibly other people, but like someone resists, or not even resists, someone like pays late, right? You can't tolerate that. And you have to let everyone else know that you can't tolerate that. Because if you just let them pay late, then everyone else is going to think they can pay late and all these things. And then, like, it's not going to be good. So what do you have to do is you have to just show some display of force.
Break some kneecaps.
Yeah. Terrorize. And just keeping in mind, Cuba didn't just pay late. Cuba was like, nah, like, we're going to resist the whole thing. So this embargo is an ongoing example of what happens if you resist, if you defy the United States, right? And again, bringing that back to the international law piece, like, what do we need to look like? What does our attitude need to be in order for something like international law to actually have meaning in an environment where any country can take that position, that we have the power to, and will exercise the power to punish other countries for defying us, right? If presumably the role of aggression, right? And that goes back to World War II, right? Like a mainstay of the UN Charter is that we and when you think of international crimes against humanity, war crimes, the principal crime described by the Charter is aggression. And that involves any act of like going out and just treating another country, another state, another people's badly, like violating their human rights, invading their country, blockading their country. All of these things are gross human rights violations. And the idea behind aggression is that that's the point from which every other war crime, every other human rights crime starts, right? So the U.S., I mean, we're over here being like, yo, we're free to aggress anyone. Meanwhile, we're also like, yo, they're not, adhering to the rules of like international, they're not playing the game right, and then it just gets me to think of something else that happened. I don't know if it was it might have happened earlier this year, but it was with regards to China and this new guy, Blinken, the new Secretary of State, said something about, it's important to like rein in China because they're defying the international order. We might have actually talked about this on here, but like,
I don't think we did.
Okay, then that very phrase, right? Like, look out for things like that. China is defying the international order. What is the international order? And what does he mean by that, right? Because, like, how is China defying the international order? Okay. A better question to ask when you hear things like that is, how are we defining the international order? Don't even ask if we are, right? It's not a yes or no question. Treat it, or rather, don't treat it as a yes or no question. Ask, are there ways, like, what is the international order, and are we defying it? Or rather, how are we defying it? If you can't find an answer to that, then maybe it's a no, and we're good. But, again, don't look for the yes or no. Look for the how. Just assume we're doing it, because in this day and age, it's really safe to say that we are.
If you can't find an answer to it, I mean, you need to think a little bit more carefully about the question.
Yeah. For now.
For that question.
Yeah, for that question. Yeah. But that's Cuba. Anything else on Cuba?
No, we'll probably talk more about Cuba.
Yeah. There's a lot more to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then Haiti. We're just going to go right next door. If you don't know, Haitian Revolution, 1804. It started well before, right? Like, French Revolution started, now we're on track, right? 1789, 1791, and lasted for a good bit of time. After the French Revolution, France was like, damn, we don't have the money to, like, continue fighting these wars, to continue doing all this stuff. So we're just going to let some colonial possessions loose. Louisiana Purchase, from the United States, from Napoleon, by Thomas Jefferson, that happened in 1804 or 1803, same year or a year later, the Haitian Revolution happened. And the Haitian Revolution happened, it was the only country in the world to actually fight a revolution and win based on Enlightenment principles. And what that means is it was the only country that was actually like, we acknowledge the human rights, like the right to existence of all of our people, right? Not just like all the white men, right? Which is what the French and U.S. American revolutions did. So Haiti happened and was immediately slapped with this like billions of dollars indemnity payment to France. Like, yo, y'all won, but you got to pay us all this money so we can like continue to live. And that's, you know, at some point, Haiti accounted for 20% of France's total wealth, right? That's huge. So France was obviously like, yo, we need this. And, right, I think, anyway, since then, Haiti's been under a number of different, you know, rulers, dictators. And the U.S., just like with Cuba, has also been intervening in Haitian affairs for the better part of the 20th century, and including today. That includes the deposition of Haitian President Jean Aristide twice. Like the U.S. took him out of power once in the 1990s, exiled him. He was so popular. He was a popular leader, right? Anyway, that's why they take people out of power. Came in, started trying to implement like minimum wage shit and, you know, like getting people paid. U.S. was like, we can't have that. They took him out. They installed someone else. That didn't work out. They brought Aristide back, and then they took him out again in like the 2000s. So
the Clintons?
It was the Clintons and Bush. Yeah. So there's that, and even before that, there was a whole bunch of stuff. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, he was, I'm thinking of Duvalier. So there was the Duvalier family, Big Duvalier, Little Duvalier. They were dictators supported by the U.S. And again, that captive audience thing makes sense. You know, like U.S. investors come in, they're like, yo, I see you're growing your own rice and that y'all are really good at it. Try growing our rice. And so U.S. sells rice to Haitian farmers. Crops fail. U.S. sells pigs, like Idaho pigs or Iowa pigs, to Haitian farmers. That shit's a bust, you know.
Poor pigs.
Yeah, poor pigs and people.
Well, yeah, obviously.
Yeah. And the whole thing is just like, it's again, like it's the same story, just in a different country, right? The U.S. says, hey, these countries are really close to us. We deserve manifest destiny over these countries as well. We're just not going to talk about it in those terms because that's kind of controversial. So we're going to talk about it in terms of investment and capitalism and like making life better for the people. And the more you like don't show what's actually going on with the people, the more Americans will be like, oh yes, like this is good. Like I've seen this covered so many times of people being like, both good and bad things have happened, you know? And they'll be like, here are the bad things that are objectively bad, dictators, blah, blah, blah. And then the good things are like it increased U.S. investment and like we introduced crops to improve agriculture and stuff. And it's like, nah, like, do you know what happened with those crops and like that investment? Who did it go to anyway? I don't know how people can look at Haiti today and be like, U.S. involvement in Haiti has been good. It's had good results. That's just not the way. Mm-hmm. So recently, the president of Haiti was assassinated. That was like 2 months ago. I mean, there's still a lot of, you know, shady shit around it. We don't really know who did it. There was some Colombians, some Peruvians involved, some Americans involved, possibly a mercenary group posing as the DEA, the American DEA, and stuff like that. And then, even more recently, like 2 days ago, there was an earthquake in Haiti. Another one. 227 people dead as of the last count that I saw. Anything?
I mean, I think, you know, just wondering or just like asking, you know, who benefits from what has happened, even if Moise was U.S. backed, right? Like if the U.S. if the U.S. had a role in it, right? Like wondering like who benefited from that. And then after the assassination, like the interim like president was somebody that Moise was maybe like the prime minister or something, that he had like let go and was planning to bring somebody else in, but then that person like took charge, right? And so I think, you know, it's important to continue to remember that the U.S., despite their claim for installing democracies and free and fair elections across the globe, like has continuously done just the opposite, and that when free and fair elections do happen, go in and remove those leaders, right? So then, you know, like trying to figure out, and the leaders are just so corrupt. Like that's another thing, right? Like, so
the whole thing is corrupt.
Well, yeah, the whole thing is corrupt. And then like when you think about the like puppets basically who are installed, right? Like they're also corrupt. So money that goes to those governments for the Haitian people, right, does not actually like make its way to the Haitian people, right? And then there's other groups that go in, you know, following disasters, right? Like thinking about the Red Cross, and that money doesn't go like to the Haitian people either. And so then when disaster strikes, right, like natural disasters around like the earthquake and then the tsunami that followed it, right, there, you know, then like all of that money has already been, right, like allocated to U.S. allies in these countries and is used to help people like escape or like get out of the country either before, you know, or after some of these natural disasters. And so, I mean, right now, yeah, I mean, it feels like the role that money plays, it also, you know, like even aid during these times is not given for free, not from like other governments, so not from the U.S. government, right? It has strings attached, right? Like we see that kind of everywhere. And so like right now, if you're going to be giving money, don't give money to the Red Cross. Give money to people and organizations who are on the ground doing work. Please don't give it to fucking missionaries either. Like, you know, like that's one of the biggest things I see from white Americans like in Haiti is like, oh yeah, like I went down to this like orphanage or this like church, like fucking stop giving money there. There are people on the ground who know what their communities need and who've been doing the work for a long time. So send your dollars there.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm glad you mentioned that because that was one I was trying not to forget. Yeah, and we'll see. We'll do some research up until we post this and ongoing. So if we come across some really good donation links, you know, we've got some links with groups who are working in Haiti constantly, you know, let alone now. So we'll post those links in the description if you want to donate or participate, engage with the recovery efforts.
Mm-hmm. And, sorry, can I mention one more thing about that? And like ongoing questioning and pushback against U.S. imperialism, you know, is also a way to help and support in the long term. Like, yeah, giving money is really important, obviously, like at these times, and also like staying aware and involved and I can't think of all the words I want to think of today, but, you know, like pushing back against U.S. imperialism and questioning these news reports. I've just, you know, I was reminded on our trip how many people watch CNN. I'm like, fuck that shit. But like, you know, like if you see something about, oh no, like just ask yourself questions about why are the Haitian people being represented in this capacity,
right,
when they're represented and how they're represented.
Right. And then, you know, again, like as far as what Julia said about money going, that money that's for the people, it's really important to keep in mind that the trend with like American foreign policy is essentially that no money is given to these states for the people, right? Like if the investors, it's investor rights that are being prioritized in all of these, right? Like that kind of capitalism, that kind of neoliberal capitalism is the impetus behind, or at least, you know, at the moment, and, you know, as history shows for a while, behind intervention in these countries, right? Captive audience for capitalism, for their markets, captive markets. So what takes priority is that investors can get what they want when they want it, how they want it, which is in direct contrast to the wants and needs and interests of the people. So we have to keep in mind that whenever we see that the US government, is sending large amounts of money to other nations, especially smaller nations that really can't fend for themselves, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in South America, and this isn't like exactly how it is, but it's essentially a cachet, it's a payment to those leaders to advance the rights of the investors, right? So like just when we recognize that like it's money that's being sent for the people, we put those quotes in there, those finger quotes, because for the people means for the capitalist class in that country and for the capitalist foreign investors who are putting their money in that country. But it never means for the actual people who are, again, it's in the investors' interest to slash their rights as workers, right? No overtime, no sick pay, no minimum wage, no living wage, no like any of this, no this or that, no healthcare, no benefits, right?
Yeah, and yes, and to clarify, like I was also talking about other countries who would send like money, like listening to Diallo Cañada's podcast and like him talking about Venezuela sending a bunch of money, right? So like other countries are, have in the past and will in the future send money to try and support other countries. And it's important to like understand, like what's the relationship and where's that money going? Because like as Kwadjo was mentioning, right, the way that the US government sends money helps them create a narrative, right? So they send money to the investors and then they can tell the American people, oh, look, like we sent this money, but it's not getting to the people because the government's corrupt that we installed. They leave that part out, right? And so like now we need to go in and take these other actions to help save the people who are being terrorized by their own government, even though it's in the best interest of the United States as is going in to invade, right? Because that makes money for war profiteers in the United States, right? And so maybe that's a nice transition to Afghanistan, but I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to say one more thing about Haiti and Moise, and Julia touched on this earlier, just that he was not popular. He was elected in 2016, and if you'll remember, Facebook kind of came under fire shortly after the 2016 election season, not in the States, but like across the globe, for having interfered in like the democratic elections of several nations across the globe. Ghana included, Haiti, again, countries in South America. I think they were implicated somewhere in East Asia. It was a pretty sizable list. He was not popular. He was elected under shady conditions, and he was hated. Like, he was not popular because people just didn't like him. Like, he was popular because he continued that trend of like, brutal repression of the Haitian people. Meanwhile, like the U.S. is like, yo, we're on good terms with him. Both Trump and Biden were like, yo, we didn't assassinate him. Like, he was our boy, Mm-hmm. So, like, just keep that in mind. Julia mentioned this earlier, as far as the United States going around and pretending to be in favor of, like, democratic elections and democracy and all this stuff. But when it comes down to it and you look at who the people are that we're actually supporting, there's always evidence that, who we support are the people who will listen to what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And again, that runs in direct opposition to democracy, right? Like, the people of your nation want you to listen to them, not to what the leaders of other nations want, right? That's not democracy. So.
Yeah, and, with that piece, too, about Trump and Biden and Moise is also, this was happening. Moise's transition out of power was supposed to be happening, right? Or there was a fight around it at the same time that the US election was happening and Trump was talking about, well, like, the election's going to be fake, like, I'll just stay in office, whatever the fuck he was saying. And people in the US were getting all, hot and bothered, like, he can't do that. That's against, like, the Constitution. And, like, well, how are we going to handle that? And what are we going to do? And then Biden gets into power and he's like, oh, no. Like, we should just, stay in power for that extra year, even though he's not supposed to be in power anymore.
Right.
And there's supposed to be a transition. But, like, that's cool. But, like, Trump staying in power here, that wouldn't be cool. Right. So, like, consider those things, too. And the narrative that's being created, right, like, around the propaganda with, well, like, he's doing what's best for the people in that country. And so, like, we need to support him and we need to do X, Y, and Z, right? But in reality, everything that Kwadjo just said in the past 15 minutes. So, yeah.
And then, so to Afghanistan. I'm not going to say much about Afghanistan because as far as, like, conflicts and even parts of the world that I know about, Afghanistan's not one of them. They've got a history of, like, Soviet affiliation, U.S. affiliation during the Cold War. Obviously the whole Osama bin Laden association and, the fact of the Taliban having been, like, funded by the CIA, Osama bin Laden himself having been American educated and, like, trained in order to help fight the Soviets in Afghanistan when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in, like, the 1970s, 1980s. And then we wanted to be in Afghanistan for one reason or another. We invaded Afghanistan 20 years ago. We've been there. Every president who's come in and out of office in the United States since that invasion has been like, we're going to pull troops out. We're going to pull troops... Well, after Bush has been like, we're going to pull troops out. And then, fails to do it. And then recently, Biden, really these talks started with Trump. There was a treaty that they signed like last, I don't know, it was in like September, August. It might have been a year ago, like under Trump with Afghanistan to like, it was some sort of armistice and we'll pull troops out. So Biden's inheriting that. The big expectation for like a lot of left pundits who are not war hawks is that has been for a while, like since this treaty and before obviously, is what is the big thing going to be that gets us to not pull out of Afghanistan, right? Because this is what always happens. We're going to pull out and then, oh no, but like this very foreseeable thing that is obviously inevitable when we pull out is a reason we can't pull out, So it's like you either believe we should pull out of Afghanistan or you believe that we should stay in Afghanistan literally forever. And I like the way Naomi Klein put it. This is just a way of thinking about our involvement in Afghanistan and in Iraq, is that if you look at it from like a political standpoint, militaristic standpoint, it doesn't make sense to stay in these places and it didn't make sense to engage in these conflicts. But if you look at it from like a military industrial economic standpoint, right, capitalism standpoint, and like I forgot what term you used, like war economy or like war profiteering, right? From that standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Like these contractors have people, the privatization of our military and military exploits, right? What it means now to occupy a place is to really contract a bunch of different corporations to go in there and do different things from like the actual fighting and murdering to like infrastructure construction, selling weapons, selling arms, and just other services that people in those situations need. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that as far as perpetual conflicts, like chronic conflicts, and why as a nation we're so reluctant to pull out, thinking about the military-industrial lobby and the vast stakes that they have in staying in these conflicts.
I don't have a very, I don't think, like, nuanced understanding of the implications and all the details of what's going on. But like the big news over the past day or two is that the Taliban is taking Kabul, right? Like that they've been kind of like they'd been like occupying, taking over several territories around the country, headed to the capital. Then there's this question of, well, like what's going to happen when they reach the capital? People are, you know, like fleeing for safety. And I think one of the really important, well, there's, I mean, several important things, but thinking about this through an American lens, you have to take in all of the other contexts, right? Referring to the Taliban as a misogynistic terrorist organization is like, okay, and right, like, so thinking about that too, then like from the US, well, like what was the US doing when they were over there? Oh, right, terrorizing the Afghani people and raping people, right? Like, you know, so trying to figure out, like, and like you said, what was going to happen when American troops pulled out of Afghanistan. I mean, fuck, obviously, right? Like, there's not a lot of, like, it doesn't take a fucking, like, whole lot of understanding or intelligence to know, like, what's going to happen when you go in and oppress several groups of people. Some of those groups you had armed a couple decades before with a bunch of fucking weapons and pissed off, right? Like, it doesn't take a whole lot of, foresight. It just takes, right, like a couple years of, not even a couple years, maybe like a couple months of understanding how like playground dynamics work, right? Like with children and in school, right? Or just like understanding some of how the United States operates. So my suggestion or encouragement would be to like the same thing that we've been saying this whole time, right? Is to like analyze and dig a little bit deeper with all of the propaganda that is going to be headed your way around the Taliban and what that means for the U.S., who went over and entered a war and invaded countries they didn't have any business doing, or any, I mean, not that I think there's any valid reason, but any of the supposed valid reasons they stated they had, right? Like their goal was to make money and exploit people and land. And they've done all that. And now there's probably going to be this question around like, well, what's the U.S. military going to do now, right? Like that they've gone in and fucked over another, not even just another country, but like continued to fuck over another region of the world. Right. And all the implications that are going to be coming our way, and then how the U.S. is ultimately going to play victim around that to then
continue doing what it's already doing.
Yeah. And when all of this is coming your way, I would also really encourage you maybe to think about what it might feel like or be like if another country invaded the United States. And like, honestly, you really don't even probably have to go very well, depending on who you are and where you live. You will maybe need to go kind of far for this, but think about what it would be like to be under constant occupation as somebody who's literally just trying to go about and live your daily life, right? And some people in this country already experience that. And that's what the United States is doing, right? Like there's, you know, like times last summer when around this country, right, when we saw tanks in Atlanta, you know, and the military in Atlanta, that's what it, like, that's what the U.S. is doing all over the world, but with more killing, right? And like more resource extraction, or resource extraction in a different way. So I would encourage you to also be thinking about like the people on the ground when you're taking in all this propaganda that's ultimately going to try and have you hating the Taliban for doing the exact same shit that the US is doing, and condemning whatever Afghani government comes out of this, and the people of Afghanistan who are much more similar to you than you are to the US government. Right. Or to people in power.
And, you know, keeping in mind it's not just the US government, but, you know, right, private corporations.
Yeah, who are funding the US government.
Yeah.
Anyways.
And then, I mean, this is just an anecdotal note that kind of speaks to who it is who's actually the bad guys in this situation, like what we think of, right? Like when we think of the Taliban, like being able to define what the Taliban is. Because if we don't actually go out and look and research what the Taliban is, as a word, it's been used so common that like pretty much every American is familiar with the idea of the Taliban, and like Julia said, associates them with terrorism, and like, I don't think most people associate them with misogyny, but that's definitely been coming down the pipes in more recent years. And I mean, like, it's pretty easy to associate fundamental Islam or Islamic fundamentalism with misogyny. So like, if you're aware of that association between Taliban and Islam, then it kind of makes sense. But like, what is the Taliban, right? That's the question to ask yourself, and then to go out and answer. I also need to do that answer. Like, I have a pretty good impression of what they are, but I need to do a better job, before I say it here. But just making sure we're doing that, right? Because if we just take it from like U.S. media and U.S. propaganda, they're framed in a dehumanizing way from the jump, right? Mm-hmm. So we do that, and then here's the humanizing as far as our antagonists. Because I remember talking with someone on Instagram, and he's a former military person, and I think he was deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq or something. And I made some post, and he said something about like, yes, U.S. imperialism, but like there are some genuinely bad people there who are like hurting Americans, or something like that. With one question being, whose fault is that? Like, who's sending Americans to be in this place where we have no business being? And then another question is like, right, like Julia said, like if you imagine that you're in your community and your community is being involved, like invaded, occupied, there are people in your community who are going to fight back. And how are they going to be perceived, right? Like, if they fight back, right? There's some people who are going to fight back because they believe the community should be liberated. There's some people who are going to fight back because their family is in direct line of fire, having nothing to do with like anything that the whole conflict is about. They're just trying to protect their family. And I think of like children who literally take up arms in Afghanistan to literally protect their families and are murdered, or are caught and treated as prisoners of war, right? And we know how America treats their prisoners of war for the crime of protecting their family, right? Like, how do you justly protect your family in a situation like that? And that's a question for y'all.
Yeah, and it's a question that links a lot of people across the globe.
Right.
I think, right? Like, because as you were talking about that, I was also thinking about Palestine, right? And how Israelis, which is really just a stand-in for the U.S., right? Like, treats Palestinian children too.
Right.
Yeah. There was something else I was going to mention as you were. I don't remember, so go ahead.
And this is one thing that's kind of on the anyway. As Julia said, as far as things that link, common stories, keeping in mind again that U.S. media has a vested interest in framing opposition as monolithic, taking nuanced positions, right? Like when you think of Afghanistan, you don't think immediately of like a diverse spectrum of political opinions, right? Which exists, even if that diversity is like, kind of like localized. So it's important to keep in mind that like U.S. media is going to show us people who are pro-American occupation and they're going to show us people who are pro-American occupation and then people who are like terrorists, or pro-terrorism. Okay. Mm-hmm. So like people in Afghanistan who are like, there was it the Black Alliance for Peace? Someone did a program and they had like a couple of Afghani representatives, like people just talking about the occupation, talking about the history of it, talking about the current implications for people on the ground. And this guy said something to the tune of, I can't be like someone who has a nuanced opinion on this situation and thinks that the U.S. occupation is just as bad as like the Taliban, right? I can't be someone who thinks that the Taliban is at least Afghani, right? And has that claim to be here, whereas the U.S. doesn't. I can't be someone who doesn't approve of what the Taliban is doing at all, but I also don't approve of what the United States is doing. Like, because I have those positions, the United States sees me as a terrorist, right? They just lump everyone who disapproves of their approval being there as a terrorist, and it's really important for us to make note of that there are nuanced positions here. There are people who are against the U.S. occupation and against the Taliban. And there are people who are pro-Taliban, right? And it's important to hear them out as well, right? For the sake of, like, we're listening to indigenous voices, right? So we need to listen to all the indigenous voices and find a way to, like, come to some sort of solution that doesn't really involve U.S. militarism, imperialism, continued, ongoing, things like that.
Yeah. And folks who have a nuanced opinion or fall somewhere like on this spectrum, right, their lives are probably in danger, right, from both sides. And so that's important to consider too. And the thing that I was going to mention too, like you mentioned U.S. news, and I really think that expands to like all Western news, right? So like other Western countries are critical of the U.S. as far as the U.S. in the U.S., right? Like as far as Donald Trump or how the United States government is handling COVID or like police abuse in the United States. But when it comes to international things, right, like reading the BBC is going to give you a U.S. perspective on what's going on in Afghanistan, right? And so like keep that in mind, seek out multiple sources or other sources and stop watching CNN.
Yeah. And I'm really trying not to say more, but to what Julia said, like, I think there's often this impulse, right? This sense that, oh, I've listened to like one Afghani person, like now I have their perspective. And, just as far as like this, program was from several months ago. Yesterday, I listened to one of the reports, like an Afghani youth on the ground. I don't know how young he was, but like, maybe 20s, early 20s or something. And he was a correspondent to someone who I think was a British newscaster. And they were pretty much like, tell me about what's going on, like the newscaster. And like this kid is like, yo, it's really scary over here. Like the Taliban's coming in. We're afraid of what's going to happen. Like I'm afraid. And like this dude's like, what do you think about the U.S. being there? And he's like, well, like people were saying that they left too early. Like we would like to. And you just have to think about like, what is the overall effect of this person's like opinion? Yes, it's important to know that people are scared. It's important to know why. It's important to know whatever. And it's also important to make sure that you listen to that and don't be like, okay, all Afghani people want the U.S. to come back. Mm-hmm. Right? Because that goes completely against what Julia just said about making sure you get a number of different sources. Just because you listen to one authentic source doesn't mean that you're good. And more likely than not, if you listen to that one authentic source and you didn't look too hard to find it, that's the source that's being put out there, So like, yeah, because this was like, I'm pretty sure it was a CNN thing. And I clicked on it and I was like, I just want to know what they said. So CNN's putting this propaganda out there. And sorry, I call it propaganda, one, because CNN's putting it out there. Two, propaganda is very easy to find. That's part of the nature of propaganda. And then three, because it's a person, like indigenous person, who is calling for, not explicitly calling for foreign U.S. military intervention, but like providing testimony that's going to be used to substantiate that kind of intervention, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's also, I feel like so many things to consider in that too, when you're not to like discredit, how people are feeling when they're like in the spaces that are shifting and changing, but hearing like we're really scared because like the Taliban's rolling in and like maybe the U.S. left too soon is not saying like super glad that the U.S. like invaded, you know, my country
Yeah.
where I live, and
In
then
the first
created all
place.
these things. Yeah, and that's all I've ever known if I'm in, you know, like my early 20s,
Yeah.
right? Or like, and understanding like
Damn.
where that person is, you know, kind of like, excuse me, on the spectrum, and in their country, right? And like the impact, right, like of all of the conflict on that person and their family. And so like that's an important thing to consider too, in terms of like people's opinions and fear and what's to come. Because I think, I mean, I feel like an idiot saying this, but I'll put it out there anyways. If you've known something for your entire life and you've figured out how to like survive and be in that system, right? Like a whole new thing coming in because that old thing felt like you were just, you know, like disposable and didn't matter and didn't like bother to like do anything helpful for the future, right? Like this new thing coming in, like, is always going to be probably kind of scary. Or there's like a big question mark about like, well, what's going to happen now, right? And like, is this a setup for more conflict? And I don't know. I mean, that could go into the whole thing that you talked about when you were on Dan's podcast about like
Change
everybody
being scary.
fears, yeah, everybody fears change,
Even the people who fight for it.
right?
Do you have anything else?
Well, there's lots of things, but we can wrap up.
All right. We're going to do a part 2 recap so we can get to everything else. But until then, comment if you like this
Yeah, our
this
new
new thing.
backdrop.
Yeah, Julia hooked us up with the greenery.
You shouldn't have told them. You should have just let them see.
Oh, yes,
I hope
yes.
you like it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really for you, but I do hope you enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely like it more. It feels like I have a,
Got a spider in your head.
no, a green hat.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Yeah, but, we'll catch y'all later.
Thanks for joining us. So long.